Watching Kyle's unboxing videos again?
Yeah, he always finds the coolest... No way! A robot dog? Gotta ask where he got it.
Or use your Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra. Just draw a circle around the dog on your screen, and it shows you where to buy it right in the app.
Whoa, I just learned a new trick. And that for once, I beat Kyle to the next big thing.
Circle it, find it with the new Galaxy S24 Ultra and circle the search with Google. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Internet connection required. Results may vary based on visuals.
If you see them inside, it's probably too late. Termites, that is. Notorious timber-toothed Ted and his swarm of outlaws are always on the trail to the next meal, which might just be your house. But these home wreckers are no match for Terminex, with quick-draw expertise and specialized training guaranteed to protect your home. That's been the truth around here for 75 years, and it ain't gonna change. Visit TrustTerminex.com to keep these pesky outlaws dead or outside.
Hello, Duke fans, and welcome to episode 373 of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. It is Tuesday afternoon, December 28th, 2021. You thought that we were going to be back maybe later this week to recap a basketball game that Duke was going to play, but as you probably know, if you're listening to this, Duke is not playing a basketball game on Wednesday, so we're coming back earlier to talk about what happened and what might be going on going forward. There's also a new ESPN bracketology prediction that is out, so we can talk a bit more about the ACC and the rest of how the current bracket stacks up, at least according to Joe Lunardi. But before we get to all of that, I am your host for this episode. I am Sam Klein. I'm coming to you from my home in Boston. I am joined, as always, by Donald Wine and Jason Evans. Jason, sir, how are you today?
Yeah, wow. I was really hoping we were going to be talking about Clemson. We did that. It's kind of funny. We did that whole Clemson preview podcast, and I hope folks still listened at least to the second half of that podcast where we talked about Dukies in the NBA. Like, especially like I was talking about Cam Reddish. He's exploded the past couple games. So we were right on time with that stuff. But literally within hours, I think, of us recording the Clemson podcast, word came down that there was going to be no game against Clemson. Oh, well.
You could have listened to it in that very short span between when we released it and when the news came out. Although I think that the Twitter rumors were basically starting like right after we posted the episode. Donald Wine is also here. Donald, how are you doing this week, sir?
I'm doing fine. Back in DC, had a nice couple of days down in Texas. But now I'm back in DC. It's weird. It's that tweener like type of weather where it feels like it's really warm, but it's still in the like 40s. Today, it actually got up to 60. And then tomorrow is going to be 30. So I'm not sure what old man winter or old lady winter is doing right now, but bring me the snow. I don't want this 60-degree December weather. Give me the snow. That's what we're here for. That's what winter's about. So
I hear that. I want to talk for a few minutes. The reason that we came on today is to talk about the dramatic effect that COVID has had on the Duke program and on college basketball. We don't need to dwell too much on the litany of games and programs that have been temporarily shut down because of too much virus exposure. But I did want us to update about what's going on at Duke, maybe speculate a little bit about how much of the schedule is going to get hurt and then potentially recovered because of COVID. So as of right now, it's Tuesday afternoon. Yesterday, Monday, Duke announced that there were rumors flying around that Duke may not be able to play its game against Clemson. Yesterday, the men's basketball program made that official. So they've put off the Clemson game. It has not been rescheduled. It has been just sort of temporarily, or it's been suspended. They're not saying that they won't play it, but they're not saying that they will
not
play
canceled, it. Suspended. Yeah, that's right. A key difference.
So there are holes in the ACC schedule and Duke's and Clemson's schedule that may allow the teams to make this game up. But as of now, it's off the schedule, as are many ACC games. throughout the conference this week. Some are still going on, but a lot of programs in the ACC and around the country are being hit by the new spike in COVID cases that's going on, obviously not just on college campuses, but across the country. Duke has said that the Notre Dame game, or Duke has not indicated yet that the Notre Dame game on Saturday, Duke is supposed to be hosting Notre Dame on Saturday. No word that game is on or off yet. The Twitter rumors that were going around when the announcement first came that Clemson was going to be canceled talked about how, the Notre Dame game is probably also out given the timing of COVID restrictions. But subsequently, the CDC and then the NCAA and the ACC followed with updated guidance about restrictions regarding, isolation post positive COVID test. Previously, it was 10 days. Now the recommendation is just 5 days post positive test when folks can get back out into society again, which has impacts on all kinds of institutions, but specifically on the college basketball schedule. The 10-day waiting period can encompass maybe 3, even 4 games, depending on exactly when the tests are coming back. Now, with a 5-day break, you're only looking at 1 or 2 game periods in there. And specifically to Duke, the reduction from 10 to 5 games means that Duke may still be able to play the Notre Dame game with limited player participation. We don't know yet exactly which players may have to sit out a game on Saturday, but that is the current state of things. So, Jason Evans, I want to toss to you first. What do you make of all these changes that have gone on recently, and how do you think it's going to affect Duke and ACC basketball?
I've got a few different thoughts on all this. The first one is, hey, good thing this happened right now. I would much rather miss games today and then have the Duke team be, clear and healthy for a few months. In fact, a friend of mine, I was talking to a friend of mine, a fellow Duke fan friend, and he said, hey, why don't we put the whole damn team in a room together and make sure everybody gets COVID at the same time? Just get it over with. And then he's like, and then in 2 weeks, we'll be all set, and these guys will be clear all the way through April.
This is the chicken pox approach, right?
Yes, exactly. And there's some merit to that because even though it appears a previous infection won't necessarily help you fend off Omicron, an Omicron infection, they believe, will keep you clear of Omicron or other COVID for several months at least. It's sort of like getting an extra vaccine or an extra booster to get the disease. So like I say, it's this isn't the worst time in the world for this to have happened. And by the way, it's worth noting that our understanding is that pretty much all the players are asymptomatic, that they don't have a bad case of COVID. Everyone on the Duke squad was vaccinated in some way. Some of the Duke players apparently got the J&J vaccine, but most of them got mRNA vaccines. That's Pfizer or Moderna. Most of them got it in the summer about 6 months ago. And lo and behold, around 6 months in, they say you really need a booster. There was some concern. I've heard that there was some concern about getting boosters during the season and not wanting players, because sometimes when you get a booster, you get a little bit sick and maybe you're out for a day or two. And so one of the reasons Duke hadn't been boosted yet was that they were like, oh, let's sort of wait and see if we really need these boosters. And really, folks weren't talking about boosters that much until a couple weeks ago or so. It just didn't seem like it was a big issue. And then Omicron came washing through. And it's my understanding that everyone on the team was given a booster right after the Virginia Tech game, that we played Virginia Tech, and literally right after that game, because they knew we had the Christmas break, we had a break. It was a good time if guys are going to get sick from a booster or a little bit sick, to give them a booster. So everybody was boosted right after the Virginia Tech game, but it was too late at that point. The boosters did not come on in time to prevent this outbreak. And the stuff I'm going to talk about next, I want to stress, is speculation from a well-informed source. I'm not sure if all of you follow Zion O on Twitter. His Twitter handle is Duke NBA, but this guy is definitely connected to the Duke program. He was one of the first, if not the first person to say, Duke's about to go on a pause.
He was the first. I'll give him credit for that. He literally posted something that said, we were not playing games this week about 18 hours before the news came out.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that Zion had some of the best information about the secret scrimmage that Duke had with Villanova. He was one of the only people to post stats from that. This guy clearly is connected to the program. So I'm going to tell you some of the things that he said about this COVID outbreak at Duke. And again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that we know this. This is what someone else has said about it. And I think it's worth crediting him, and it's worth spreading the information because this is really good info. First of all, he said that Duke was absolutely thinking about playing with only 7 players. And that we were thinking about playing even though there were going to be multiple walk-ons in those 7 players. And that Duke was fully ready to take on Clemson with, 2 or 3 perhaps walk-ons getting serious minutes. But then one more test came back, and there was one more guy who came back positive. And as a result, we only had 6 players, and that was not enough for Duke to be able to play this game. Duke was not afraid of playing with a dramatically reduced squad, not because we're overconfident, but because we knew that the NCAA selection committee would not consider a COVID game as a real game. If Duke went out there and lost playing, a couple walk-ons and a couple guys who were deep on the bench and only maybe 2 or 3 of our regulars, we knew the NCAA selection committee is not going to hold that against Duke. The other really interesting thing that Zion O said, he said that Duke believes that Virginia Tech is the one that gave this to Duke, that Virginia Tech was playing with a positive player. Now, his implication was that Virginia Tech knew they're playing with a positive player. I don't know that that's the case. I think that's a pretty tough one to put on a team. My bet is that doctors and coaches wouldn't do that, but that the speculation from Duke is that there was a positive player on Virginia Tech who, in the course of us guarding him, being on the court with him, breathing all over him and him breathing on us, that he passed this on to several players in the Duke team, and that is how it hit the team so hard so quickly. And by the way, it's worth noting that the Virginia Tech team is on pause this week. They do have a bad case of COVID on their squad, and they were supposed to play UNC. They're not going to be playing Carolina this week. Anyway, that's kind of the stuff that we've gotten on this. Some interesting stories in there. I'm not going to vouch for how true they are, but they certainly ring like they could be true.
Jason, it's interesting, and it feels like there are a number of layers to this. I almost want to ask you guys to speculate on what the most interesting 7-man rotation that Duke could throw out in a game is. But Donald, I want to bring you in here as well. Any other sort of speculation that you want to add on top of this, or reaction that you have to all the news this week?
Yeah, well, I mean, what Jason provided is a lot of information, and I want to start with the most important thing was the last part that Jason mentioned, that there was 6 players, only 6 players that could play, because the ACC says that if you have 7 players and a coach that are healthy, no matter who those 7 players are, you must play the game or it is a forfeit. When they changed the policy, all games that were canceled due to COVID were going to be forfeits. At this point now, if you have 7 players and a coach that are healthy, you were able to do so. And since we only had 6, that made it where we were eligible. Here's the thing. The ACC, even in their guidelines, says if you have 6 players, you could still take the court, but you don't have to. And that is the point where Duke said, hey, let's make this, let's postpone this game. Let's get our guys back.
And by the way, Donald, really quick, I want to point out, if it is true that that a player on Virginia Tech passed this to the Duke team, it would make sense that walk-on, like we heard, that walk-ons were the guys who didn't get it. And the guys who were a little bit deeper on the bench were some of the guys who didn't get it because they weren't in the game against Virginia Tech to have caught it from this player.
Right. Right.
I was going to say, and that the Duke team, you mentioned, Jason, that they all got boosters soon after the game, and then they all went home. They had a few days off for Christmas. I did think it was interesting, actually. They are college students, and I don't begrudge them getting to go home for the holidays. I did think it was interesting that Duke released the whole team to fly home to family for a couple days to then come right back. It did seem a little precarious given the situation with Omicron right now, but I'm not gonna tell them not to. I assume that they're giving them instructions about how to gather safely, et cetera. But to your point, after that game, it's not like the team had any activities before everyone went home for break. So if you caught it that night from a Virginia Tech player or from whoever else was maybe in the arena, because of course if you're in a confined space like that in Cameron Indoor, you're running by a lot of other people that are going to be close by, be they behind the benches or near the sidelines or something. But if any of them caught it there, they weren't then going to pass it off to anyone else until after the break. So that's sort of the interesting dynamic here.
I'm totally fine with them releasing the players. I knew they were going to release the players. They did it last year. If you remember, we even postponed or canceled the last 2 non-conference games we had on our schedule so that the guys could have a mental break and go home. And that was before, or like right as vaccines were coming online. So that was when guys did not have vaccines. This year they do have vaccines. As you mentioned, they just got boosted. Everyone, like, it feels like everyone's catching this thing, and it's not due to the holidays. It's not due to Christmas travel. People have been catching this all month here in DC. We had more cases this past weekend than we had the entire year. Sink that in. The entire year,
that's
we had
crazy.
Less
Wow.
than the number of cases that were positive over the last 4 days here in DC. And DC has been very, very good about this. So you have to, at some point, you have to trust the players that they're going to take the right actions and make the right decisions. And even in spite of doing that, we still have at least 8 players that have COVID. So that is unfortunate. And I don't begrudge the kids for going home and to Duke for releasing them. Jason, you mentioned that they were vaccinated over the summer, which also makes sense. Because if you remember, Duke is requiring all students to be vaccinated to be on campus. So for them to even arrive on campus, they had to have been fully vaccinated, not just one shot. They had to have both shots before they arrived on campus or receive their second shot upon arrival on campus. So these guys, we knew they were vaccinated. Now we know they had just been boosted. Now they're going to have some of the antibodies that are able to keep them hopefully healthy the rest of the year. I will mention this. When Duke NBA, when Zion was talking about that there wasn't going to be games this week, keep in mind that was before the CDC guidelines came down. That was before the ACC amended its previous protocols with regards to isolation. That is why I think the Notre Dame game was not postponed outright, that there's still hope of that being played, because the CDC guidelines lower the amount of isolation that is required for asymptomatic players or asymptomatic people. And so those players have a chance of being fully cleared and ready to play on Saturday. It's just a matter of whether we have enough players to do so.
You know, and I want to point out one more thing about testing. And this is really important to note, because Coach K has been very clear that he wants more testing from the ACC so that they're able to prevent a situation like what potentially happened with Virginia Tech passing this to Duke. Because it is not only possible, but probable that Virginia Tech was not actively testing their team prior to the Duke game. The ACC last year had a testing policy where you had to test players, I think it was like 48 or 24 hours, 36 hours, something like that, before a game. There's no such policy this year. The only policy the ACC currently has involves testing of unvaccinated players. And those unvaccinated players only get tested either 1 or 3 times per week. And it sort of depends on how much how many guys are vaccinated on your team. If your team is 85% vaccinated, then the unvaccinated players are only tested once per week. So, when we have a variant like we have now that will evade a lot of vaccines, you've got to go to a system where there's going to be more testing. And Coach K has been really talking about this. And I really wonder if at some point the ACC will catch on and require more testing so you can prevent situations like what potentially happened with Duke and Virginia Tech.
It's interesting that you mentioned the more testing part, because I saw a tweet from Jeff Goodman, college basketball analyst, on Twitter the other day about programs and whether they tested all of their players when they got back from their Christmas break or not. I thought it was very fascinating. He polled 125 college basketball programs, so about a third of the college basketball programs in the country and D1. And he asked whether they tested the entire team when they came back from Christmas break, or only certain players that may have been showing symptoms. 73 of those teams did not test the entire team. Only 53 programs said that they were testing everybody. And he mentioned, and he obviously didn't give specifics on teams, but he mentioned that of those 53, the bulk of those teams that tested everyone are the teams that you're seeing in COVID pauses right now because they tested and they found a lot of asymptomatic players. So I think there's something to be said about this. This is why it's being spread so quickly, is that, and this is not new. We've been talking about this since March 2020. Asymptomatic people can spread this to other people. We are seeing it now in the NFL where the chief medical officer for the NFL is saying that asymptomatic people don't carry the virus. And I think that's very misleading and very dangerous, because it's clear that these guys are getting it. And like in the case of Virginia Tech, one player could have spread it to an entire basketball team of his own and the opponent they were facing. And that's unfortunate, because I highly doubt that person knew that that they had it at the time. And they wouldn't have known it if they didn't test. This is why we should be doing more testing. And honestly, going back to the chicken pox theory, I had chicken pox. Chicken pox sucked, but I didn't die from it, and I wasn't at risk of dying from it. I'm not trying to find out via the chicken pox theory whether this COVID strain is mild. I hear it's mild, and I want to stay that way. I want to keep hearing about it. I don't want anyone to have to go through the isolation, because you never know who it'll affect, and it's affecting everybody differently.
It's a tricky thing, and I know that when we were having this conversation last year, I took a pretty tough stance on, as restrictive as we want to get with this, we should be, because we don't know. And to your point, Donald, even if things are mild now, it still feels like there's sort of no harm to the student athletes or to the college experience to take it a little bit more cautious and be careful with not just the players, but the coaches, the people who are in the arenas. Because if you've been to a Duke game or you've been to any other college basketball games, there's lots of people very close to each other. And even if they're all wearing masks, and even if they're doing all the things that they need to do, they're still going to be standing very close to each other. And you might have mask policies. That does not mean that they are being followed to the letter. So I'm totally fine with Duke or the ACC deciding that they want to be more careful about these sorts of things.
And really quickly for me, last point on the coaching staff here at Duke. If you recall last week, or the last few games actually, Nolan Smith has not been on the sidelines because he has been in the COVID protocols. This is not anything to do with this recent outbreak that we have on the team. If by those, the timeline, Nolan Smith is probably emerging from his COVID protocol, so he should be okay. And obviously we hope that he is. I do want to speculate in the positive, right? And not COVID positive, but just in the, nicer way of things. If it was Coach K that was one of these people that were COVID positive, we would have known about it, because last year, if you remember, him being exposed to COVID prompted an announcement. He was out for 10 days, and John Shire even managed the team in his absence for a game. So I saw people trying to speculate whether Coach K had it. I feel like we would know if it was him. Everyone else is going to be blanketed by the policy that Duke has. But if it was Coach K, I think we would know about it right now. And I highly suspect that he is not one of them, because as you remember, he was one of the first to be vaccinated in the ACC. He was one of the first to be fully vaccinated. And I'm pretty sure he has received the booster well before everyone, because he got it so early, got his second shot so early. So I hope everyone that has it continues to remain asymptomatic and is okay. But I think when speculation about who on the team has it, there's no point in doing that right now.
All right. And my final thought, speaking of speculation, I've seen some people out there on Twitter, on the DBR forums and elsewhere talking about, the NCAA needs to set up a bubble again for the NCAA tournament. The ACC needs to try and compress things together and lock these kids down in different places when it comes time for the ACC tournament, stuff like that. I've seen people saying that Duke should go back to separating the players from the rest of the student body and putting them back in the hotel and that kind of thing. Let's slow our roll. If there is one thing that COVID has taught us again and again and again, it's that if you try and predict how it's going to move, how it's going to change, and how we're going to respond to it, the only prediction that's accurate is that you're wrong. It was just 2 or 3 weeks ago that none of us had heard of Omicron, that the concept of a breakthrough case really wasn't something that people even were thinking about very much. And look at how fast things have changed. I think trying to say, oh, the NCAA tournament, the ACC tournament in March, we need to take these steps now because of what's happening now for something that's going to happen in March and April. That's a mistake. I think what we should learn about COVID is you need to move. It moves fast. And so you should move slowly and you should follow its lead in figuring out what to do. And I'll be very disappointed if Duke or the ACC or the NCAA takes far-reaching, long time out steps to deal with Omicron, because Omicron may be gone seriously, it may be gone in 2 or 3 weeks. There are epidemiologists who say that's a possibility. I think we need to, you deal with the stuff as it happens and don't do anything too drastic about any one situation. It's just in the past week or so that all the different conferences have said, oh, by the way, if you can't play, it's not a forfeit, because they recognize the situation changed. And I think we just have to be ready to adapt to whatever comes along. And we shouldn't go too crazy about trying to figure out how we're going to deal with Omicron 3 months from now.
In short, this is a dance, right? And it's like swing dancing. Your partner's COVID, and COVID happens to be the greatest running back that ever lived, who can juke you out in every second. So every time you try to figure out a move, he's 4 steps ahead. Like, this is what it is. And everyone just has to take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and make sure that you're doing the right steps, because and I think at this point, give yourself some grace, and that you could still do the right things and still end up with this. And that's the fact of life. But the idea is to protect yourself, protect the people around you. And hopefully that is enough to make sure that nobody else gets this and the tide starts to stem a little bit.
Yeah, we certainly hope that no one's getting seriously ill here, and that our main concern is that people stay healthy. The basketball games are secondary to all of that. All right. We will return, I'm sure, to this conversation at some point, because it is inevitable, basically. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk about Joe Lunardi's first bracketology of the season. Now that we've got a couple months of games in the books, and there are results that we can talk about sort of at a broader level. Duke, of course, is expected to have a very high seed in the NCAA tournament. The rest of the ACC, not so much, but we will cover that and a few other items, so stick around. Welcome back. We are going to dive into ESPN and Joe Lunardi's bracketology projection for the 2022 NCAA tournament. Before we get into this, I don't want this to come off too much as the DBR podcast fully endorses the Joe Lunardi bracketology projection, but we know that it is sort of widely read and understood and digested. So this is content that we can react to. I think that as a general statement, we'd be more aligned to whatever Ken Pomeroy says is going to happen. The DBR podcast this week renewed its annual Ken Pom membership, which is money well spent.
All the metrics.
Yeah, that's right. So we can get all the fancy numbers and relay them back to you for free, because this show is ad supported. But we do want to talk about Lunardi's projections, because they are, even if not perfect, a good indicator sort of where things are going. So that projection came out this week. The quick highlights, and then I want to turn it over to Donald and Jason for a bit more deep dive. So Duke is currently projected as a number 1 seed in the East region, where they would be playing the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8 in Philadelphia, the site of the most famously, I think for Duke fans, the 1992
Kentucky
Sweet 16 and Elite 8.
I was there.
Also the site of the 2001.
Jason was on date night that game.
That's right. Also the site of the 2001 Sweet 16 and Elite Eight, which I was in attendance for, at least for the Elite Eight. So those are fun facts for you. Duke is joined on the one line by Purdue, Baylor, and Gonzaga. I don't think any huge surprises there, given that all four of those teams have been ranked number one at some point this season. And if this bracket sort of happens the way that Lunardi projects, Duke would be playing Michigan State as the number 2 seed in that Elite Eight game, which I'm sure would be all kinds of fun for the talking heads, us included, to talk about an exciting potential Duke versus Michigan State, Coach K versus Tom Izzo Elite Eight game, which we had very recently in 2019. So I want to get into sort of whatever is interesting to you about this bracket right now, just as a bit of fun conversation fodder. So Donald, I'll let you go first. What did you find interesting about Lunardi's projections? And feel free to talk about, any like particular teams, how the ACC looks in here, which is not great, about where Duke is and what their path might be. What sparks your interest in this bracket?
Yeah, well, let's start with the ACC. And the ACC has 4 teams in this bracket, according to Joe Lunardi. Duke obviously being the 1 seed in the East, also joined in the East by 10 seed Virginia Tech. You have UNC as an 8th seed out West. And then in the Midwest play-in game, you have as an 11th seed, you have Wake Forest. So there's obviously, we've talked about how the ACC is viewed in the eyes of the country. And according to this, the ACC is not looked upon favorably by Lunardi or other bracketologists when it comes to the NCAA tournament. But I know we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but there's a couple of things that I thought was interesting. When you see this bracket, you see the word AQ next to some of these names, and that means automatic qualifier. That would mean that this team has won their conference tournament and gets that conference's automatic selection into the big dance. It's interesting because Lunardi has a couple of teams on the 2 line that are not listed as automatic qualifiers, and the automatic qualifiers for that conference is listed by a team that is on a lower seed. So, for example, the Big Ten, which has 10 teams in this, Purdue, which has been one of the best teams in the country so far this season, is not listed as an automatic qualifier. That honor for the Big Ten goes to Michigan State, which is a 2 seed. So that's interesting to me. There's also one that's interesting because Arizona is listed as a 2 seed in the same bracket as Tennessee. Tennessee is listed as a 3. Why do I mention those 2 teams? Well, Tennessee just beat Arizona last week. So I think it's interesting that not only is Tennessee on a 3 line underneath Arizona in the same bracket, it is the real key here. Not necessarily like one's in the East and one's in the Midwest, but they're both in the same region, according to Lunardi, even though Tennessee just beat Arizona. And I know the the committee likes to look at rematches, but not necessarily in the Sweet 16. They try to look at them in the Elite Eight and beyond. And the final thing, they have UCLA listed as a 2 seed right now. And again, automatic qualifier from the Pac-12 that he has listed is USC, which is in the 3. I would probably have Houston or Tennessee on the 2 line right now. I don't think that UCLA is quite a 2 seed. They haven't been living up to the expectations that they had by basically making a deep run through the NCAA tournament last year to the Final Four. But I do think that there are some teams that are kind of out there that are interesting. Again, Houston is one of these teams that I think is very interesting. Tennessee has been playing quite well this year. And I think one of those 2 teams could make a run where they can leap up to that 2 line. And I stress all of this to say, all of this can change. Every last bit of this can change. We're talking about this on December 28th because it's something to do. But Joe Lunardi is great about making brackets in the early season that allow for some of this conversation. And like I said, the ACC can look at this and say, hey, if they feel disrespected, they should be, because the ACC has 4 teams in this bracket. Some of these teams need to figure out how to make it 6 or 7.
So the easy way for the ACC to make it 6 or 7 is for some of the ACC teams that are on the bubble to play better than they have been. Currently, Joe Lunardi has Clemson and Louisville as the next 4 out, not the first 4 out, but the next 4 out. So, they've got like 5 or 6 teams they would have to hurdle, Clemson and Louisville would, to get into the NCAA tournament. And by the way, Wake Forest, as you mentioned, Lunardi has them in, but he has them in the play-in game, which means that if there were a couple, conference upset winners of conferences who steal a bid, that could potentially have knocked Wake out. The ACC could be looking at only 3 teams. We've talked about it a lot in this podcast. The ACC, some of these teams are going to need to separate because it's not the kind of thing where they're going to just take the top 6 teams in the ACC. This year, if you want to make it, you're going to have to separate from the rest of the pack in the ACC in a pretty significant kind of way. So the thing I really looked at that I thought was most interesting was I wanted to look at who Duke could potentially play along the way. Sam mentioned, that Michigan State matchup, with Duke as a 1 and Michigan State as a 2. That's so far down the road. I really looked at the 8-9s and the 4-5s. Lunardi has Duke getting the winner, the 8-9 game of Michigan and Oklahoma. The other 8-9s, just so folks know, the other teams that he thinks, a 1 seed might play are BYU, Iowa, Loyola, Chicago, Arkansas, UNC, and Indiana. Now, look, obviously we're going to avoid Carolina. There's no way they're going to match us up with Carolina in a round of 32 game. But I'd really rather not get Michigan there. Michigan's a team that a lot of folks thought was a top 10 team coming in the season. They've struggled so far. And so I hated seeing Michigan on that line, in line to face us potentially in that next game. I also really don't want BYU. BYU is always experienced and old. They have those guys that take a mission and then they come back to school. BYU's usually got a couple 23, 24, 25-year-olds playing for them. I want no part of that. And then the other thing I looked at was the 4 and 5 seeds that Duke could potentially match up with. Lunardi has us getting either LSU or Xavier as our 4-5s. We could also get, and you're going to hear some familiar names here. The other 4-5s include Ohio State, Alabama, Kentucky, Providence, Auburn, Iowa. Lots of SEC teams in there on that 4-5 line. Personally, I would love for Duke to potentially get a rematch with Ohio State. That's a real possibility, sort of where the teams are seated right now. I think that, usually the opposing team sort of has a little more motivation against Duke because we have this big name and we're this big time program. If we play Ohio State this year, I think we will have plenty of motivation. And I just like to say right off the bat, immediately, I want no part of Alabama. I do not want Duke to play Alabama. Alabama is a team that shoots 1 million 3-pointers, like more threes than anyone else in NCAA. And if they get hot one game, you're out. There's nothing you can do about it. If they're bombing away from 3 and they're hitting them, doesn't matter how good you are, they can take you out. So I'd really rather not see Alabama and take the risk that they're having a good day from outside. Anyway, that was sort of the interesting stuff I saw in the bracket. Last thing, did you guys see who one of the number 11 seeds was? We mentioned, Donald, you said there are 10 Big Ten teams in the dance. One of them coming in as number 11 seed, Chris Collins' Northwestern squad. Lunardi said if the tournament was today, Chris Collins would have Northwestern back in the dance. I should point out that in the entire history of Northwestern basketball, from the beginning till right now, Northwestern has made the tournament once. 2017. Chris Collins got them there in 2017. If he does it again, they should rename the arena for him.
Rename the arena. I mean, they should rename the university, Collins University in Chicago. There you go. Sounds like a great one to me.
It's not even in the Northwest anymore. Like it may have been part of the Northwest once upon a time, but it's
ripe for change
now.
So, Midwestern Collins University, I think sounds really good.
Sure. I look, I don't find any of this surprising, but what stuck out to me just again is how I wouldn't even call it mediocre the ACC is this year. And Duke being a number 1 seed, the only other ACC teams in this bracket, UNC at an 8, Virginia Tech at a 10 in Duke's region, interestingly, and Wake Forest as one of the 11 seeds that would have to play one of those play-in games to get to the main field. So a 1, an 8, a 10, and 11. I have not done the deep dive on how long ago it has been since the ACC only had 4 teams and only one in the projected should make the among the group that should make it to the second weekend. But this would be a historically bad draw for the ACC.
The ACC's never had. The ACC, I believe, has never had 4 teams since we expanded. Since we added those big like Syracuse and those Big East schools. There was a time in the 90s, I feel like the ACC only got 3 teams one year, but that was when I think we only had like 9 or 10 teams in the conference at that point.
We only had 9 teams, but we also back then there were routinely years where the ACC would get 7 out of 9
Yeah.
in the NCAA tournament. Like, I think they still have the record for like percentage of teams that make the dance, because 7 out of 9 was like almost near certainty. Absolute certainty was like 6 out of 9.
Also hits home that all the other teams in the conference basically have to be rooting for Duke continually, other than the days when those teams are playing Duke, because Duke is the key to everybody getting one really, really good win on their resume the rest of the season. So, and I know how much other ACC teams hate rooting for us. So I will relish that for just the little bit that it's worth. I do wish that Duke had more opportunities on its schedule to get good wins, but that's where we're at right now. So even that Clemson team that we had talked about earlier this week, that Duke was supposed to be playing this week, who we said, look, is probably a bubble team. They're not in Lunardi's bracket right now. They could make it back in, but they don't have many opportunities, especially if they don't get a shot against Duke this season.
Quick question for you, talking about the ACC related to another Power 5 conference, the Pac-12. The Pac-12 under Lunardi's bracket has 3 teams in the dance.
Yeah.
USC, UCLA, and Arizona. 2 2s and a 3. Would you rather have that for the ACC, or have 4 teams spread out throughout the seeding? At least I feel it seems like having more teams spread out means that there's more opportunities for teams to rise. For the Pac-12, it feels like even though they have 3 teams on the top 3 lines, the only thing they can do really is fall. Like they can't. The rising tide is already at the top. It's not lifting any ships. Whereas some of these teams, if Virginia Tech gets hot, if UNC gets hot, then they can lift up some of the teams like Clemson or Syracuse or something like that into the dance.
Yeah, I'll tell you that I'd rather be the Pac-12. I'd rather have 3 teams that are all expected to win not just one game, but probably 2 games, as opposed to being the ACC, where Duke is the only team that will be favored to win even one game, perhaps. Carolina's an 8 seed, 8-9. But the rest of the ACC is expected to be out before the tournament, even reaches its first weekend.
So, as we mentioned, we will be back later this week to preview the Notre Dame game. Hopefully, we're doing just a standard preview and not issuing another conversation, I guess, about the fact that Duke had another game canceled. So we'll cross our fingers that Duke and Notre Dame do get to play on Saturday. And I think earlier I had said that Duke was hosting the game against Notre Dame. They're actually supposed to be playing in South Bend. So my apologies for getting that one wrong. In addition, later this week, we would like to do a mailbag episode. So we didn't specifically ask about this previously, and so maybe folks are holding back questions. But if you have general questions about this year's team, prior Duke teams, anything related to Duke basketball or sort of the set of topics that we typically cover on the show, feel free to email us this week, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. We would like to empty the mailbag, so to speak. So if you have lingering questions, we think we've got time to spread out on the show this week. So happy to dive into those.
Hey, actually, I'd even say if folks want to ask us something else, we'll do some research. We'll look into some things. You want to ask us something weird that's not necessarily related to Duke basketball? I can't promise that we'll answer it, but
yeah, don't go too weird.
Yeah,
but on the weird scale 1 to 10, we're thinking like 3 to 4. Don't go 9 or 10.
Give me 1 or 2 topics that you all would like to answer questions about. Jason, you go first.
I mean, I haven't prepared for this at all. So, I mean, obviously, if folks want to ask me things about movies, I'm a little bit of a movie expert.
Movies and poker.
Movies and poker. There you go. Those are 2 good topics for me.
Donald's already got a soccer podcast, so don't ask him soccer questions. Subscribe to Stars and Stripes FC, right?
Where I will be doing a mailbag episode later on today. So I will answer those questions over there. Music. Nice year for music. I can answer a couple of music questions.
Donald can
especially.
do music questions, and I'll do all the music questions that Donald can't answer. So if you want
all the bluegrass,
people have bluegrass.
If you want to talk about bluegrass, folk music, jam bands, I'll cover all those, and maybe we'll get some of your questions answered. So anyway, email us once again, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. We have gotten a lot of great mail recently that I think we've responded to all of. So those conversations have been fun, but would like to bring them onto the show, so to say. So for Jason Evans and for Donald Wine, I am Sam Klein. This has been episode 373 of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. Your tasks this week, listener: 1, email us, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. 2, if you have not, go get boosted for with your COVID-19 vaccine. We really appreciate you doing that. And if you've done both of those things, then make sure you're subscribed, rating, reviewing, all those things with the show. We'll talk to you again later this week. Until then, Duke Band, take us home.